Today's webinar presentation is titled Growing Red Oak in New England. Our presenter is Ken Desmarais. Ken is the Assistant Director of District Ranger for Timber for the Pemigewasset Ranger District on the White Mountain National Forest. His duties include overseeing all timber management on the district and serving in a leadership role in the administration of the district. Ken is recently retired from the New Hampshire Division of Forests and Land, where he has served as the administrator of the Forest Management Bureau for 12 years. He started with the division in 1984 and served in various forestry positions involving field forestry, applied forest management research, and administration. Ken is currently an adjunct faculty at the University of New Hampshire, Thompson School of Applied Science, and in 2017, he co-authored the publication Ecology and Management of Northern Red Oak in New England. And so with that, welcome, Ken. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Kate. Just want to clarify something. I was an adjunct with UNH. That must be an older part of my bio. I'm no longer there. So thanks everybody for signing into the webinar. I think this is going to be a fun hour or so. And I just want to keep things light and make this an enjoyable hour for everybody. Most of my work with oak, though, occurred before I came here to the White Mountain National Forest. We don't have very much oak here, especially on my district. And so it's kind of a rare thing to run into oaks. But I did a lot of oak management prior to coming here to the Forest Service. So, hang on. My screen's not advancing. Wonder why my screen's not advancing. Okay.
Ken, this is Kate. Do you?
Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead and just close down the PowerPoint?
Okay.
And try to open it up again.
My computer's froze. Wow, I never expected this to happen. Remember it froze in the practice yesterday? What did we do different?
I don't. Let's see here.
I can't remember what we did.
I'm trying to think. I don't think we did anything different.
Okay. There was the on-off switch, and then I turned it off, then back on. Well, okay, hang on a second. Are you still with me?
Yeah, you're still live. Okay. So let's see here.
Okay, so it just advanced.
Okay.
Can you see it advancing? Kate, can you see my next page?
You know what? Hold on a second. Sorry, I'm trying to troubleshoot. I've actually gone to a different page. So let me just get back here myself. Oh, never a dull moment. Like I said, it must be a Thursday.
It always
there
happens.
you go. Looks like we're back live. So again, apologies everybody for that technical issue. But looks like your next slide has advanced, Ken. So take it away.
Great. Okay, so I just want to say that this webinar sort of was spurred in part by the release of a new publication called Ecology and Management of Northern Red Oak in New England, which is published by the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. So I just want to put a big thank you out there to Cooperative Extension from UNH for helping us put this together. It was a big deal to have UNH take on the publishing duties to get this done. My authors, the authors of this publication, primary author Bill Leake and Mariko Yamasaki from Forest Service Research Lab in Durham, New Hampshire. Jeff Ward, who was the principal scientist at the Connecticut Forest Experiment Station. There's myself, and then Karen Bennett from UNH Cooperative Extension. If you want to get a copy of this publication, you should send an email to Karen Bennett, and I have her email address down below, karen.bennett@unh.edu. And while you're asking for this publication, there's another one that I have there with Cooperative Extension about the biology of reproduction of red oak, and I think you'd find that one interesting as well. So great. And so red oak is a really very highly valuable tree species, both for timber and wildlife habitat. It has really high value for lumber, both domestic and foreign. And the demand has just been pretty good for it for a long time. And even though the price sometimes goes up, sometimes goes down, it seems like you can sell oak on a pretty regular basis. It's also a highly valuable wildlife species. I think there's over 30 species of wildlife in New England that use acorns for one reason or another. And I think it's also a valuable tree for aesthetics, because the stems can be just so interesting. They have kind of a rugged, unique look, especially street-grown trees. And sometimes we find them in the woods that they look kind of just kind of I don't know how else to say it, but just a very rough, unique look to them. And I also enjoy oaks in the fall because I love that beautiful bronze foliage that it produces, and it will retain that foliage for quite some time into the winter. So you should be seeing a range map of red oak, and it goes from approximately southern Canada down to southern Georgia, which is a pretty big range. And an interesting fact is Prince Edward Island, the provincial tree there, is a northern red oak. And it's pretty hard to find a red oak on that island these days. And an interesting thing about it is I think that the oak that was there when the first colonists hit the shores of Prince Edward Island, there were a lot of oaks there, and it just goes to testify to the long life of oak, because if you track climate back in the prior to about 1400, there was a warming period. There's talk about grapes being grown in Labrador, and so I think the climate had warmed quite a bit at that time, so that oak was growing pretty well there on PEI. Then through a series of reasons, kind of diminished, and now they're actively planting oaks there on the island again in anticipation of the current warming trend. Great. So let's see. Oh, just one more thing is down in the south, there's sort of a debate going as to whether the oaks that grow down there are a different species or subspecies of northern red oak. And so when we talk about quercus rubra, we often will say variety borealis to make sure we're distinguishing the groups of oak that grow in the north. Great. So this comes from the new publication, and I just wanted to talk about the current occurrence of oak. And you're going to see that, so these states are in alphabetical order, but if you look at Maine, has a very small amount of oak, and so does Vermont. But Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island have a fair amount. And I want you to look at the Massachusetts and New Hampshire. They are almost exactly the same for oak. Massachusetts has about 12.4% of its growing stock volume in oak, and so New Hampshire has 12. So probably within the sampling error, probably the same. And then if you look at the number of red oak seedlings, Massachusetts, saplings, Massachusetts, 2.5% of the saplings growing in Massachusetts are red oak, or 2.2% in New Hampshire are saplings. And so the states are just so close. It's really one big landscape. I don't think the oaks know when they're growing in Massachusetts or New Hampshire. But the important fact here is, though we have a substantial volume in these two states, if you look at the number of saplings, it's quite low. We would hope to see, for 12.4% of the volume, we'd want to see 12% of the saplings. And it's just not the case. The number of saplings is very low. And so a lot of people are concerned that maybe our oak resource isn't sustainable at this point. Well, I think there is hope in that, though. We're going to talk about this more as the webinar continues, but One of the things that my colleagues at the state of New Hampshire and I had done several times, we'd go into regenerated stands and it looked like we had a total oak regeneration failure. Then we'd pull out some orange flagging and we start flagging the few oaks that we could find. And sure enough, by the time we were done, the oak presence in those stands was very reassuring. And some work that Chad Oliver did when he was working on his PhD, he said, concluded that really don't need that many oaks to fully stock a stand. And so I have pretty good hope for oak in the future. I don't think it's quite as gloomy as we might think. So we're going to talk a little bit about reproductive biology, something that I'm really interested when it comes to oak. And there's going to be a number of photos, and I just want to credit Tom Lee for taking those photos. Some of this work comes from back when I was a student at University of New Hampshire. I was doing an independent study under Dr. Dick Wyrick. I needed to take some photos, and being a poor student, I didn't even have a camera to take the pictures. And so Dr. Lee graciously took those photos for me. So I just wanted to recognize him for that. Okay. So you should be seeing two photos on your screen. The photo on the left are the male flowers, and on the right are the female flowers. And most people aren't acquainted with the male flowers, and except you might see them on your windshield on a rainy morning in the spring because they're attached very delicately to the stem. And so if you get a good hard rain, they usually get knocked off the tree and, like I said, accumulate under the windshield wiper. But I started looking at those and I was just very fascinated by it. So in the spring, so these photos come from the UNH herbarium, which was a great resource to tap into. So on the left, the male flowers, and they'll produce pollen that just is windblown or transported by bees and land on the stigma of the female flower. So I'm going to just highlight this so you can see it. Let's see. And so right there would be the stigma, just the very tip of that flower. And it's a sticky tip. And so when the pollen flies over and touches it, it sticks to it. Then what happens is it starts to grow a pollen tube down the styles. That'd be that slender length that goes down towards the flower itself. Now that pollen tube will continue growing through the year, through the season, but it will stop before it hits the ovary down here. And it just, when it gets close, it just stops. And I guess it's just something in its design, but it stops before it hits the ovary, doesn't fertilize it, and then just doesn't do anything for the rest of the growing season. And then the next year, when the growing season starts back up again, it will reach the ovary, fertilize it, and a new acorn will be formed. The red oak group takes 2 years to produce an acorn, whereas the white oak group, that's the Lepidobolanus, they produce an acorn in 1 year. The other thing is the white oaks that produce the acorn in 1 year, they'll actually pop a radical or a embryonic root out that fall and get it into the ground as soon as possible, whereas the red oaks, they wait till the spring after they're on the ground. Whoop. So what's going on here? Okay, I think my screen is froze up again. Oh boy.
Ken, can you go to the thumb control panel there?
Yep, I'm going to erase the drawings. There. Okay. It's froze up again. Let me just think about this for a second. I think I'm going to have to avoid using the pen. think I've got it. Oh, no. Okay, I think I'm going to hit the double lines. We might have to re-engage a second. Any suggestions, Kate? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so remember, you'll need to, if you can double click on the pencil or the crayon on the thumb control panel to go ahead and go back to normal arrow mode.
We're back there now. Can you see just a twig on your screen?
Yep, your slide's advanced. You're good to go.
Great. So one of the things I really love to do is to pick up oak twig off the ground, especially in the wintertime. It gives me a pretty good idea about what's going on as far as the forthcoming acorn crop. A lot of people mistake these twigs, the things on these twigs, as just all buds. But as you can see in the middle of that twig, those are some one-year acorns on a red oak tree waiting to grow to become second-year and mature acorns. You can still see the stigma and the styles from where the pollen tube came down. In fact, sometimes when the acorn is mature and falls to the ground, you'll still see those the style and the stigma on the acorn as well. So anyways, that's a pretty good way of checking to see what's coming along for acorns. And of course, acorns are produced every year, but some years there's a great abundance of bumper crop, and other years there's very, very few. This is a look at the inside of an acorn. I'm going to speed things up because we've lost a lot of time with these problems. So I'm going to rush through a little bit faster than normal. So here's an acorn, and you can see the outer coating or the pericarp. What I really wanted to focus you on are the cotyledons in the inside. And so these cotyledons are hypogeal, which means they stay inside the nut. When you're in the springtime, when you're looking at things that are germinating, you're used to seeing the cotyledons poking out. But with things like oaks, they stay inside the nut where they're protected. And what will happen is the radicle, which you see down the bottom of the screen, will come out. And that will go into the ground and try to get situated in the mineral soil. And this happens when the temperatures outside are roughly 32 to 41 degrees. But the epicaudal, or the embryonic stem, it doesn't come out until the temperatures warm up. They tried keeping the acorns at 32 to 41 degrees for up to 220 days, and the epicaudal never came out, or the stem, it never came out, not until they would warm up the temperatures. And so that's just the way that the acorn protects itself, because if that epicaudal or embryonic stem gets damaged or killed, that's it. That tree is done. It's not going to do anything more. And so I just thought that's an interesting look. And then there's this hypocaudal, which is just a little extension, and we're going to see that in just a second here. So some seedling characteristics once the acorn germinates is that oak is favored by disturbance, and that's a theme I'd like to hit on throughout the rest of this webinar. And resprouting of seedlings is really a preferred way of regenerating oaks. So here you see a germinated acorn, and you can see that embryonic root, or that radicle, and look how long that is compared to the epicaudal, or the embryonic stem. Now just beside the acorn you can see the hypocaudal, and that's what kind of works as sort of a scaffolding before the embryonic stem comes out. And so that if you were to pull a 1 or 2 year old oak seedling out of the ground, oftentimes you'll still see the acorn attached to it. In fact, I've planted acorns and sprouted acorns and came back in the fall and couldn't find them lots of times because the squirrels came back and ate the acorns even after it sprouted. So they might taste a little bit better. I'm looking at 2 oak seedlings here. The one to the far right, you'll see it has a root that looks like a carrot. And that's typical of what oaks look like. Oaks, because they're prone to disturbance, they're designed for disturbance. They put down a good strong root to try to hedge against death by disturbance. And usually just below the ground line, there's at least one, sometimes two buds, so that when the top gets damaged from disturbance, either fire or wind throw or whatever, sometimes animals, that bud can sprout and put up a brand new shoot or a brand new stem. And that's actually a pretty good way of regenerating oak, is to keep smashing down the stem. And it's hard for foresters to do that when they have good oak regeneration in place, but you got to keep smashing that stem to increase the root to shoot ratio. Now on the left side, you'll see a very fibrous root. At the State Forest Nursery, where they grow oak seedlings, we got the idea of undercutting the oaks when they are very young, before they develop this long carrot root. And so as soon as we would cut off the roots, then we would water to keep the seedlings alive. And cutting them off develops this very fibrous root. The advantage to this is when an oak has this long carrot root, it just grows so slow in the forest. It's just agonizingly slow. You don't think it's ever going to respond to any treatment. But if you have the fibrous root, like on the left, it will respond quite vigorously, but it's more prone to disturbance. It could be killed more easily. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about stand development. Here, that bronze crown you can see in the middle is a red oak crown. And I kind of like to equate the crown of these oak trees to a sprig of broccoli. They had that same kind of convex top to them, and they spread out. And this is a growth strategy of red oak. And we'll see more about that later in the webinar. So it seems like many of our current red oak stands, they developed as advanced regeneration in the understory of white pine stands. Many of those white pine stands contained no red oak stems. So the question is, where did the oak come from to make the advanced regeneration? And it's pretty well established that most of those acorns came from blue jays. If you look at my, if you get my previous publication from Karen Bennett, there's a section in there called Squirrels and Blue Jays. I just want to quickly run through that with you. And it says, squirrels and jays move and consume acorns. According to Healy, squirrels and jays can move a staggering number of acorns. He reports the squirrels bury acorns within 200 yards of the source tree. But Steiner suggested that in Pennsylvania, squirrels may not be a large consumer of very viable acorns, even in good years. Squirrel populations are often low. Squirrel populations at the time of establishment of many presently mature stands may have been much higher, although no quantitative data is available. Blue jays may bury acorns as far as 3 miles from the source. Jays prefer small nuts. They often carry up to 5 pin oak and only 2 to 3 of the red oak acorns per trip. Jays then bury the nuts in the forest for retrieval and consumption at a later date. This Darley Hill and Johnson reported data from 11 collecting trees totaling 130,000 acorns that were dispersed by blue jays in Virginia. And so it was an interesting experiment. I don't have time to go into big detail, but with a lot of students, they were just tracking these birds with binoculars and could actually track the amount of acorns that blue jays were distributing. It's an amazing story. So they would plant these acorns in white pine stands, and then oftentimes they couldn't find them again, or the birds were killed and never made it back. And so this advanced oak regeneration would develop under white pine stands. So when the white pine stands were cut, thereby crushing and resprouting and releasing the established oak advanced regeneration, a new oak stand was established under a former pine stand. So we talk about crushing red oak, and it's hard to get foresters to do that, because when you have a great regeneration layer of oak, who wants to go in and smash it to pieces? But oak is different from, say, sugar maple. Oak is, like I said, it's designed for this kind of treatment. And so the carrot-rooted red oak advanced regeneration, like I said, is often frustratingly slow growing. It just doesn't like to respond to release. And so you have to build this regeneration to what I call the established condition by repeated crushing and resprouting. And so remember, it has that deep taproot, so it can take a lot of pounding. Resprouts will recover their former height in only about 2 growing seasons. And so if you're leaving established red oak advanced regeneration uncrushed after a harvest, often they become flat topped and they don't respond well to release either. And by crushing them, they'll send up a nice straight new shoot, which will be far more vigorous than what was there. And so it's often critical to crush and resprout that advanced regeneration, especially after the final harvest. Here I have some site index curves for 4 species. And what I want to show you is red oak is the blue. And lots of times when you're looking at oak at a young stage, it looks like it's been completely overtopped, especially from species like red maple and black birch. And it looks like it's just hopeless. It will never make it to the overstory. But again, going back to what Chad Oliver had found in his doctoral dissertation, is that oak is tough. I like to call it the bully of the woods. It beats its way up to the overstory, just pounds the other trees, and it gets one branch above them, then another branch, and all of a sudden it's growing above those competitors. And so once it gets above, it doesn't relinquish the overstory to them ever again, and it just grows and it fills out horizontally over the tops of them, and just dominates the sunny space in the stand. So you should be seeing a red oak stalking chart. And I hate to use that pencil again. I'm afraid it's going to lock up the screen. So I'm going to try to describe to you what I'm looking at here. So if you look at, you should all be familiar with a red oak stalking chart. And if you look at the 4-inch lines, that would be where you see the B and the A. There's a 4-inch line that goes vertically from lower left to upper right. So that would be for a quadratic mean stand diameter 4 inches for that stand. If you were to follow that down vertically to the x-axis, you'll see that those stands, when they're up fully stocked, they have roughly 1,000 to 1,100 stems per acre. Now, when that stand grows to just 1 more inch in diameter, you see if you go over to the 5 off the A line and drop it down, it goes down to about 650. And so just in growing 1 inch, that stand will lose about 350 to 400 stems per acre, which is a dramatic loss. And that can happen in a fairly short period of time. And so that's a pretty dramatic disturbance in that stand. And then if you look from, say, 5 to 8, if you take an 8-inch stand at the A line and drop it down, it goes down to about 300 stems per acre. And so you're looking at from 4, when it's a 4-inch stand to an 8-inch stand, it's going to lose 700 to 800 stems per acre, which is a pretty dramatic loss. So oaks, I think can think of 2 conditions that I find oaks growing in that really make a big difference. And so when most of the stand is oak and you have a lot of oak to oak competition, that's when you're really going to get very hard competition. And so the stems tend to grow very tall and straight because they're all fighting it out with each other for that canopy. The other condition is when oak is mixed in with other species. As soon as if oaks are in a low number and they make it above, say, the black birch and the red maple, and they start to spread out, you don't get a lot of, generally don't get a lot of stem length out of that. So the oaks can be pretty fast growing, but they go into a crown early. And so you might get maybe a 12-footer or maybe a log and a half out of that stem. Whereas where there are a lot of oaks and they're competing side by side really hard, I've seen 3.5 log oaks out of stands like that. And we're going to look at some numbers a little further in the webinar that really kind of show the importance of that. So I'm just wanting to talk with you really quickly about relative density. It's a metric in the stand that I use a lot. And remember that A line we were looking at? If you were to, I'm going to just try to go backwards for a second. Great. And so if you look at the A line for, say, an 18-inch stand, you're going to see that it's roughly around 117 square feet of basal area. So if I had a stand that was stocked at 80, which would be about where the B line is, the relative density there would be 80 divided by the 117 that the A line's at. So really relative density is just basically stocking percent. What percent of the stand is stocked compared to what it could be if it were at A line. So in this example, I used 82. And so if the stand is stocked at 82 and the A line is at 117, that would be about a 70% stock stand, or the relative density would be 70%. So here comes Ken's first rule of thumb. If you can thin a stand by 1/3 of its relative density and still have a residual relative density between 40 and 60, then I say you should do it. If you can do it commercially, especially. And so what happens is this stand that was stocked at 70%, we took 1/3 of it, and so that means 2/3 will still be left behind. So I take 82 times 2/3 divided by 117. That means when we're done thinning 1/3 out of that stand, it'll have a relative density of 47%. And so that meets my rule of thumb, and so I would suggest doing that. Residual basal area would be 82 times 2/3 would be a residual relative residual basal area about 55 square feet. So that's a really simple way to apply relative density. It can be more complicated if you look at the equation down below, how we calculate what the relative density is. But you don't usually have to do that calculation. We do it for you in many cases. And this is one of those cases where we do it for you. This is a screenshot from a cruise program that I have that I offer for free. It's called DS Cruiser, and this is under the tools. One of the tools that it gives you, and this is a thinning guide. And so if you look at that diagram in the upper right, you'll see what looks like a pine tree. And that tree just shows what the stocking is currently based on the cruise information that's in the cruiser. And then you'll see a diamond, a black diamond to the left in that diagram. And that diamond shows what the stand is stocked at after we go through the thinning game at the bottom here. And so those green cells you'll see in the bottom graph, table, I mean, those are user activated. And so you can take whatever percent of each species you want out of that stand. That diamond will adjust itself up or down. What you want to do is make sure that that diamond is between the two red lines. The bottom line is 40% relative density. The upper line is 60% relative density. And if you see at the bottom of the table that you can play the game in, it says try to get this between 40 and 60. And as you can see, the way I played this thinning game here, I've got the relative density at 59. And I think that's a pretty good place for this particular stand. So that's DS Cruiser, and that's available for free for anybody who'd like it. If you use the cruiser and you like it, I'd appreciate hearing your positive experiences. If you use the cruiser and don't like it, I'd especially like to hear from you to know like what it is that's going wrong and how can we fix that for you. Talk a little bit about the stocking growth rate and value change in oak stands. So we were talking about the two conditions where oak primarily grows. And so in the case where it's dominant in the stand, there's a lot of oak growing there, a lot of oak to oak competition. I like to maintain those stands a pretty high stocking until that nice straight stem has developed. And it's up to you as the forester to figure out when you want that straight stem to stop, when you want to start doing some treatments in the stand. I think it occurs generally around 45 years or so, plus or minus. I like to see, at least 2 good logs out of a stand like that. But like I said, I've seen 3 and 3.5 log stands, depending when the first thinning is done in there. And then once you start thinning in that stand, I like the saying early, light, and often, which I've heard Alan Page say a lot of times about pine. I think it fits well with oak too. I like to do light thinnings. The new term in there is interventions. There's some light interventions in oak stands every 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years. What I like to see is that the next intervention is made before the stand slows down. I really don't like the idea of releasing a stand, having it start to really grow well, then not coming in and thinning again until it's really stopped growing. I like to maintain that fast growth, but I like to do it in small amounts, and so basically a third. And so I don't have the time to go into it, but I like the step down method where you might thin a third and leave it at 60 relative density, let it grow for 10, 15 years, thin a third again and maybe leave it at 55 relative density or 50 relative density, let it grow for 10, 15 years, take a third, bring it down to maybe 40 relative density. And I think that's a good management strategy for red oaks. I wanted to show you, this is from a plot for some research I did when I was with the state. And I wanted to just show you the value of growing a tall stem if you can. So in 2001, we looked at this plot, and the butt logs in that plot had about 5,000 board feet per acre in the butt logs. The second log had about 800 board feet per acre, and there was no volume in third logs yet, but the straight stem was there. So that's plot had about 6,000 board feet per acre. 13 years later, when we came back and looked at the plot again, the butt logs had almost 8,000 feet to the acre. Although the second log had almost 4,500 board feet to the acre, and the third log had an additional 2,000 board feet to the acre. So if you look at the volume change, it was enormous. The butt logs increased by about 211 board feet per year, but the upper logs increased by double that, over 400, about 420 board feet in that same time period. So you might say, well, the butt log, though, is the important one. That's where all the value is. But when we looked at the value of the upper logs and adjusting the price to them for their grade, actually the butt logs increased by $89 a year, whereas the upper logs increased by $122. And so if you're just growing a butt log, and I know there's been a lot of people recommending just putting all your growth into that butt log, you would have gotten only $89. But if you can grow the upper logs as well, boy, if you put that in there, it's over $200 a year that you're getting from growth. Now, things aren't exactly all the same. Like if you're just growing the butt log, you probably would have wider spacing and probably better growth than what we're seeing here. But I still think that those upper logs would really contribute a lot more value than if you're just focusing on a butt log. So interesting research. Those plots are still in place, and we'll see what they bring in the future. But I was talking to somebody from a lumber company, hardwood mill, and he said that they were finding similar results from some of their work they were doing. Let's talk about acorns again for a little bit. This is from Downs, 1944. They were looking at yields of acorns, and it looks like 20-inch trees really is the maximum acorn production, but it's a slow decline from there. So I wouldn't go and cut all my 20-inch trees. But when I look at the value growth in oaks, if I'm trying to balance the economics with the biology of it, I like to grow oaks 22 to 24 inches. And so I think that's a pretty good cutoff place for growing oaks. So if you're looking for some sort of a rotation age, maturity, I think 22 is really kind of a good place to be. If your local, if your state fish and game agency is trying to push you to grow them longer, I think that's perfectly fine if that's one of your goals. But I just think you should know that there is a cost to it. You know, it's bigger trees do have a lot of value, but there's a cost to growing them in excess of 22 inches. In most cases, of course, it depends on the growth rate of the trees. wanted to talk a little bit about regenerating oak. We were talking about some of the results that Chad Oliver had received, and uh, it says that we don't really need a lot of oak seedlings to regenerate oak stands, and we'll talk about that a little more now. And I want to talk about advanced regeneration and Ken's second rule of thumb. So this is from Jeff Ward, and it's some work done in Connecticut, 224 oak stumps. And what you can see is the blue line at the bottom represents 30-inch trees. And a young 30-inch tree, really, you can only expect about a little less than 40% of them to produce good sprouts. If the tree is smaller, 20 inches, a young 20-inch tree can produce about 60% of them can produce sprouts, whereas an older one, we're looking at less than 40. Then you see a dramatic difference if you're looking at 10-inch trees. A young 10-inch tree, you can expect almost 90% of them to give decent sprouts. Whereas an old 10-inch tree, the sprouting is not nearly as good. For my work, I like to use 4-inch trees or smaller, excuse me. Sorry about that. 4-inch trees or smaller for reliable sprouting. And in fact, I've seen a lot of sprouts on 20-inch trees, but what happens is they just don't seem to survive or do well. And also, the sprouts on 20-inch trees seem to get hammered really hard by deer. So I really like the smaller sprouts. I think they're far more reliable. So what is an established tree? So here's Ken's second rule of thumb. And I have to just say, I can't take credit for this. This isn't my work, but this is my rule of thumb. And so this is an oak tree actually outside my kitchen window. I planted, and I've smashed the top down a few times to let it re-sprout. And there you can see my thumb at the base of the tree. And when the base, the root collar is the size of my thumb, roughly an inch, I'd say that tree is established. And now if that were in a stand that was being logged and that top got smashed down, I am like 99.999% sure that that's going to re-sprout and do pretty well. The other thing this tree has going for it is it's about 6 feet tall at this point. And so I kind of like these two things in my rule of thumb, is the root collar has to be the size of my thumb, and the stem should be at least breast height, 4.5 feet tall. If you've got those two things going in your advanced regeneration, you're going to have great success, unless something like insects come and kill it. So how many of these do you need per acre? Well, when Chad Oliver was doing his work in '78, he said as few as 150. And I say, I agree. I think that's a pretty good number. If we were to go back to look at that red oak stocking chart, and you look at the mature stand, let's say 20 inches, and then draw a line vertically straight down to the x-axis, you would see that a mature stand only needs roughly 45 stems. So if you've got 150, and these oaks are pretty rugged, they'll stay through the life of the stand. You'll be thinning oaks when you get into the saw timber size classes. So you'll be thinning oaks probably once they're reaching 12 and 14 inches in diameter. Now, if they're not what I call advanced, if they don't meet the terms in Ken's second rule of thumb, you got some work to do. So this David Loftus, who did a bunch of work, and I think in South Carolina, one of the things he was doing was trying to figure out, for every oak that meets the rule of thumb, how many oak seedlings does it take? How many sprouted acorns does it take to get there? And it's really kind of exponential. It can be thousands and thousands of sprouted acorns to get to one stem that meets the rule of thumb. So I've had foresters tell me, oh, Ken, I've gotten great oak regeneration. You go out and you just see a sea of oak regen. But I hate to burst their bubble, but until it gets to thumb size, all bets are off. So these are some plots that I had in at Kingston State Park. We did a thinning from below, or so-called shelterwood cut, during an oak seed year. And this was with a feller buncher that drove. It was a rubber-tired feller buncher, and it drove from tree to tree. during the harvest. And that's the perfect way to establish oak regen, because that driving over the acorns, again, acorns are not delicate, so that driving over the acorns pushes them right below the surface of the leaf litter, and you get really great results. So here we had about, I think it was 188,000 oak seedlings per acre. And I wanted to show you this to show that it wasn't just, that area around where I was sitting, but it was extensively throughout the stand. And then in another place, we tried putting these tree shelters over the regeneration. So this particular seedling right here was actually a planted oak seedling. And you can see from the bottom of where my left hand is pointing, then you can see the top of the seedling. That's the growth in 1 year. It looks like it grew about 3.5 feet. And it's not unusual for these to grow right through the tubes the first year. The problem is they're so thin and whippy, you have to keep the tubes on them, otherwise they'll just fall over. But if you keep the tubes on them for a few years, you can get some caliper on them and strengthen them up. Just be sure that when you put the tube over the seedlings, you firmly plant it into the ground, because if the air can flow underneath the tube, that tube will act like a big chimney and will dry out the seedling. We also tried putting the tubes over some natural seedlings and had some great results with those as well. Great, we made some good progress here. I'll talk a little bit about uneven age management of oak. Single tree selection, it's just not appropriate for red oak management, not unless you want to change it from oak to something else. You might get some oak seedlings germinating and some regeneration under a single tree selection regime, but it's just not enough light for oaks to develop. And so you'll lose those oaks, or they'll just kind of wither away in the understory and not do anything. That's not always the case. Craig Lorimer was doing some work in the Lake States, and he was able to get some oaks to do something in a single tree selection, but I don't think even he would recommend it. And so I'm not going to speak for him, but it just was an atypical case. I've seen oaks in that sort of situation, and they just don't make it. But if you want uneven age management of oak, I would highly suggest group selection. And so because group selection is uneven age, we don't talk about rotation age, but the same analog would be target age, really around 100 years. That's about what it would take under good management to get it up to about 22 inches. So I think groups should be no smaller than a 1/4 acre, because they're just too small, not enough sunlight in openings less than a 1/4 acre. So let's say you intended to harvest timber in the stand every 15 years. You'd consider using a 105-year target age. And so if you just divide 15 by 105, you try to put 14% of the stand in groups. And the groups would be a 1/4 to, say, 2 acres in size. And with oaks, I say the bigger the better. And I wanted to talk a little bit about oaks. You've seen this picture already in this webinar. Oaks have a very broad convex crown, which makes them extremely difficult to measure. And it's well documented that foresters trying to measure total height of oaks just fail miserably. Well, why is that? Here's just a little diagram I put together. From the ground, even the best forester looking at these oak crowns, it looks like you're looking at the top when really the top is way out in the middle of the stem. So many foresters are so confident they're looking at the top and they measure the height. But what happens is, invariably, in nearly every case, they're actually looking at a side branch. And so if you look over the tree, you can see the height estimation error, which has been documented a lot, especially by people who like to measure the big trees. There's a group called ENTS, E-N-T-S, Eastern Native Tree Society. They've documented bad total height measurements by foresters in lots of cases. But knowledge is power. So if you know that's the case, just try to adapt for it. The further away from the tree that you're standing, the better the chances of getting a good height estimate. And that concludes the presentation. I just wanted to show you this quick picture. Back in just after the 38 hurricane, there was some salvage logging going on at the Fox Forest, and this is a big oak log coming out of down at the area called Hemlock Ravine. So this little girl standing by the oak log, she just had her 90th birthday just a few months ago. This was Henry Baldwin's daughter, Barbara. And then the person over at the horses, his son actually works on the town public works department. So it's just kind of neat to have that legacy still in town. So that's just a cool picture. Thank you for coming to the webinar, and I think maybe we can open it up for some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ken. Colleen, did you want to go ahead and facilitate and read off the questions? We have a few questions that have been submitted.
Yeah. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Yep.
Okay, so I see we have 6 questions so far. It looks like they're still coming in. So I'm just going to read them off in the order that they came in. So the first one from Dan, he says, I have 40 acres of well-stocked 2 foot to 10 foot red oak. They're mature pine trees found scattered and in groups. Should I attempt to harvest these mature pine trees?
So if I understand the question properly, he has oaks that are 2 feet to 10 feet tall. The ones that are 10 feet tall are going to resprout great. And so just don't make the mistake of doing a partial cut over them. Oaks really need the light. They really do their best if you take the overstory off. So in Vermont, that's could be a problem with the heavy cutting law. So I think you might have to get some permitting done with the state. But yeah, you might not want to do the whole 40 acres, but I think you definitely want to do at least 1/4 acre openings. Half to an acre is better. And I try to put those openings where you have the strongest advanced regen right now, where the stems meet the rule of thumb, at least 4.5 feet tall and thumb size at the root collar.
Okay. From James, is oak monoecious or dioecious, if I'm saying that correctly?
Oh, that's a great question. Boy, I don't remember, but if he gets my first publication about reproduction biology of oak, I know I addressed it in there. It's just it was so long ago, I don't remember the answer to that. So if I had a prize, I'd send it out there to James for stumping me.
All right.
So I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to say it's dioecious, but I just don't remember.
Okay.
Ken, a quick Google search. It looks like it might be monoecious.
Oh.
Okay. Can you speak on the relationship between oak and hemlock, often found in codominant on dry west-facing slopes with shallow soils in southeast Vermont? This is a community type rarely addressed. Also, where can the cruiser spreadsheet be obtained?
Great. The cruiser spreadsheet, so I'll address that one real quick. Yeah, if you just contact me, but not through my work email. So you send me an email at Forest Cruiser, that's all one word, FORESTCRUISER at, that's that curly at sign, live, LIVE.com. And I'll send a copy out to you. And then the second question about the oak hemlock, yeah, that's not just a Vermont thing. I see that in New Hampshire a lot. And those can be very productive stands because often what I see is an overstory oak with an understory of hemlock. And hemlock doesn't need the full sunlight. And so in those stands, they can be very, very productive. And I think what happens is the oaks grow fast enough to surpass the hemlocks. And so in a lot of cases, they might be even of similar age. Although, as you know, hemlock is pretty shade tolerant, and so it can keep regenerating underneath the oak canopy as well. I think it's a great combination, and you know, it's always a good idea. Well, it's often a good idea to grow mixed stands if you can. Though gypsy moth can raise some real havoc in those stands as well, though. But I think more needs to be studied about those warm southwest sites where you tend to find those. I just wish there was research money to spend on those sorts of sites. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think it's those are cool places to visit and actually to work in. Next question.
Yeah, so actually, I have a clarification on the question from Dan.
Okay.
When he said, I have 40 acres of well-stocked 2-foot to 10-foot red oak, he is actually 2-foot diameter to 10-foot diameter.
10-foot diameter?
Yes.
Wow, that's an amazing oak. I don't think I've ever seen a 10-foot oak in diameter.
I'm pretty sure those are inches, just to clarify.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it's 2 to 10 inch diameter red oak poles.
Oh, okay. And they have a white pine overstory, is that right?
Yes, he says there are mature pine trees found scattered in groups. And then his original question was, should I attempt to harvest these mature pine trees?
Yes, I would. And so, you know, 2-inch to 10-inch is that size where they tend to sprout really well. And then I'd ask them, like, how many are there per acre, and are there others as well? If there's 150 an acre, he's in really great shape. In fact, if they're that advanced, I wouldn't hesitate to take the overstory off if he had as few as 50 an acre. So I think, yeah, of course, you know, one of the things about forestry is there's no better thing than visiting and looking at the stand, because there's so many factors involved. So just looking at face value, mature pine over well-stocked understory of 2 to 10-inch red oak, yeah, I'd take the overstory off in a minute, unless there's some other factor I'm just not thinking about. So good. So next question, please.
So it looks like we've wrapped up all the questions. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover, Ken?
Well, it's a big topic. There were a lot more things I wish that I could have covered, but I don't have the time, and I didn't prepare for them because I knew I didn't have the time. But if people have oak questions, don't hesitate to contact me. For just regular oak silviculture questions, you can contact me here at the Forest Service. I think that's okay. And so my email here is Desmarais, so it's KDESMARAIS with the curly @ sign, FS, which stands for Forest Service, .fed, FED, .us. And I'll try to help you as much as I can.
Thank you so much, Ken. This is Kate. I'm going to jump back in because there was a follow-up question to Dan's situation, and I'm really curious about the answer. Okay. So if you don't mind, I recognize that we're just about at 10:30, so I know folks might have to get off, but there was a question about, would you cut or crush the oak regeneration? I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Well, that's a great question. It's very thoughtful. I'm glad he's thinking about these things. That's a great question. If it was sugar maple, I think I would cut them, because I've just seen so much advanced regeneration of sugar maple get crushed and damaged. But oak is pretty tough. But you know what? It might be good to cut them anyways, because like a 10-inch oak, a 10-inch oak, yeah, in diameter, crushed can make quite a mess. And also, I would think that the landowner and logger might want to harvest that for firewood. Even a 2-inch oak is getting kind of big. So I would say that if he can afford to make the investment in cutting them is a good idea. I wouldn't cut them too early, though. Cut them just before the logging happens, because if he cuts them, they resprout, and then a whole growing season goes by before the logger actually gets in there. It could damage things again. And so it all depends, if each of those trees are growing new buds down at the base. Like once those buds sprout, I'm not sure how long it takes for new buds to show back up again. So I would cut them, if you can afford it, just before the logging starts. In fact, I'd go in there like a couple days before the skidder arrives to do it.
Cool. Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Ken. Again, we really appreciate you taking the time to share all this great information with us. Just a few quick reminders for folks who are participating in the webinar today before we sign off. Again, we are really looking forward to your feedback, so please complete that survey that you'll receive at the end of the webinar. And don't forget, you will receive a follow-up email as well asking you to complete the survey. So if you take care of it once you sign off the webinar this morning, just go ahead and ignore that email from GoToWebinar. So with that, we'll go ahead and close out the webinar for today. We are, just to let folks know, we are working on trying to line up another webinar for May. We don't have any details to share at this time, but go ahead and sign up for the e-announcement. And as soon as we have details for May's webinar, we'll send an email out. So again, Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and sharing all your great work on oak. And
Thank you.
Everybody else, I hope you have a great day out in the woods. Thanks everybody for joining us today.